Well, good evening, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed today's United We Strike Marathon. This is June the 8th, 2013, and we have had quite a few very interesting presentations. But now, I'd like you to consider just how badly you might have been nuked recently. And to discuss that topic with us tonight, we have a global radiation update with Christina Consolo, who I believe is here and live. It's all yours, Christina.
Thanks, Gary. Welcome to your global radiation update for June the 8th of 2013. I'm your host, Christina Consolo, founder of Nuked Radio on UCY TV, admin of Rads Radiation Research and Mitigation on Facebook, and my website is fukushimafacts.com. Last month on United We Strike, I began a series called Chaos versus Order, which will be comparing some of the greatest disasters of our time to Fukushima. The first video in this series was BP versus Fukushima, which can be found on my YouTube channel, Rads. Tonight, we'll be comparing the World Trade Center debris to the tsunami debris and extrapolate the epic catastrophe which is headed towards the west coast of North America. But first, some radiation news from around the world. We'll start with Hanford, the most contaminated place in the U.S., travel over to France for the latest fire info. Seems like there's one there every month I do this show. And then over to Fukushima, the largest nuclear disaster in history that is completely unstoppable, as there is no technology to fix it, which I like to remind everyone every time I do this show. Time is of the essence at Hanford's site by Marilyn Olds. This appeared in the Kingston Community News column, June 6 of 2013. The Hanford Nuclear Reservation along the Columbia River in Benton County was built in our own backyard in 1943 to produce plutonium as part of the top-secret Manhattan Project. It continued operation during America's campaign to build the biggest nuclear weapons arsenal in the Cold War, as well as producing nuclear energy. The last reactor stopped operating there in 1987. Hanford was added to the Superfund list for long-term hazardous cleanup in 1989. Hanford's 56 million gallons of the most contaminated nuclear waste in the Western Hemisphere is a true horror story. There are 177 storage tanks holding this waste. 149 of these are older, single-shell carbon steel tanks. Some of them have been there since the 1940s. Many have a lifespan of merely 20 years. There's no surprise that the tanks are decaying. In February, officials announced that 6 single-shell tanks were leaking. These are not the first leaks. There have been decades of Earth contamination. The U.S. Department of Energy has owned Hanford since 1989. Bechtel National is contracted by the DOE to oversee the construction of a vitrification plant. Vitrification means processing the waste into glass logs, which are then encased in stainless steel. The decision was made to begin construction of the plant before the design had been vetted. Consequently, there are design problems that could lead to explosions or nuclear reactions. The vitrification process is incredibly complicated and requires chemical and radiological analysis before pretreatment. One of the many problems is the lack of inventory of what toxic waste is where. The 56 million gallons of waste make up any number of different shapes and denseness so that they could be a solid, liquid, or gas. In many cases, waste has layered as it settled over time. For the vitrification process to begin, consistency of the waste materials must be made and then kept uniform in order to be able to flow through pipes and filters without clogging. Clogging could result in enough plutonium collected to trigger a nuclear chain reaction or backflow, spreading the problem throughout the entire system. Currently, there's no design to do any of this effectively. Another safety concern showing the mismanagement of Hanford is the potential for hydrogen gas buildup in double-shell tanks used to store waste removed from leaking single-shell tanks. Flammable gas builds up, and if there's insufficient ventilation, releasing radioactive materials. Adequate ventilation is being used, but there is no backup plan. Governor Inslee supports sending 3 million gallons of Hanford's waste to be stored in New Mexico. But environmental watchdog groups see the treatment process required to make this move as overly costly, time-consuming, and distracting. Sure, it would be better for Washington if Hanford was anywhere else, but wouldn't it be better to truly grasp how to make nuclear waste safely and permanently stored, if possible? Instead of going from one toxic mishap to another, it's time for better oversight. Too little progress has been made over the years. Toxic waste must be stopped from entering our environment and threatening public health. Who is our champion? President Obama and Congress, should they ever get off their politically divided arses, could create an oversight board with teeth of accountability. The federal government created this nuclear pickle after all. It cannot be swept under the rug. Senators Murray and Cantwell should be screaming at the tops of their lungs in outrage. Instead, it appears it's up to us to make our voices heard. Surely they'd all want to hear from their constituents. Some good news coming from San Diego. This was reported in 10 News yesterday. Southern California's Edison parent company announced Friday that it is shutting down the San Onofre nuclear generating station. We have long said that these reactors are too dangerous to operate, and now Edison has agreed. Friends of the Earth President Eric Pica said this morning, the people of California now have the opportunity to move away from the failed promise of dirty and dangerous nuclear power and replace it with the safe and clean energy provided by the sun and the wind. Over to France, fire broke out at a nuclear reactor. Plumes of black smoke could be seen from a considerable distance. This appeared yesterday in War.lu. No injuries from nuclear reactor fire. A fire broke out at a reactor close to the Luxembourg border in France on Friday afternoon. The blaze, which began in Cattenom Nuclear Power Station's Block 1 at around 1:40 p.m., created some panic among people in the area as plumes of black smoke could be seen from a considerable distance. And a few months ago, they had an accident there that killed 2 workers and injured 1. A recently published open-source peer-reviewed article by Andrei Pape-Moller, Chernobyl birds have smaller brains. The background of this study, animals living in areas contaminated by radioactive material from Chernobyl suffer from increased oxidative stress and low levels of antioxidants. Therefore, normal development of the nervous system is jeopardized as reflected by high frequencies of developmental errors, reduced brain size, and impaired cognitive abilities in humans. Alternatively, associations between psychological effects and radiation have been attributed to post-traumatic stress in humans. The methodology for this scientific study: here we used an extensive sample of 550 birds belonging to 48 species to test the prediction that even in the absence of post-traumatic stress, there is a negative association between relative brain size and level of background radiation. We found a negative association between the brain size as reflected by external head volume and level of background radiation independent of structural body size and body mass. The observed reduction in brain size in relation to background radiation amounted to 5% across the range. Species differed significantly in reduction in brain size with increasing background radiation, and brain size was the only morphological character that showed a negative relationship. Brain size was significantly smaller in yearlings than in older individuals. The conclusions or significance of this study: low-dose radiation can have significant effects on normal brain development as reflected by brain size and therefore potentially cognitive ability. The fact that brain size was smaller in yearlings than in older individuals implies that there was significant directional selection on brain size with individuals with larger brains experiencing a viability advantage. If it happens in the birds, it will happen in the people. Over to Japan, a recent interview with a Japanese diplomat: we are facing global catastrophe over the next 40 to 100 years because of Fukushima. The title of this interview was Fighting a Dragon I Cannot See. The source is Fairwinds Energy Education, dated June the 5th of 2013. At 33 minutes in, the host says it's clear that the west coast of the United States will be affected by the radiation from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. Akio Matsumura, diplomat, says, let me clarify, we are facing global catastrophe that is occurring. From that perspective, over 40 years, 50 years, even 100 years, we cannot escape from this fact. For that, we have to keep in mind this radioactive material or contaminated water, in any case, reaches out to your west coast as well. If you are counting on Japan, I can assure you now, they do not take serious action. And from Juneau, Alaska, the 5 West Coast states affected by debris from the 2011 tsunami in Japan are about to receive an initial $250,000 each from a $5 million gift from Japan for cleanup. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is distributing the money to Alaska, California, Hawaii, Oregon, and Washington, and will allocate the remainder as additional needs arise. It's unclear how far the money will stretch for what some state officials and beach cleaning groups expect to be a years-long problem. Alaska is preparing to ask NOAA for up to $750,000 in additional funds to help with cleanup this year. Unlike other states where beaches are accessible year-round, many of the beaches targeted for cleanup in Alaska are remote or hard to reach, sometimes requiring that debris be hauled out by boat or even helicopter. There also is a narrow window for conducting the work, generally running into September. While some crews already have been out this year, poor weather has delayed the start of cleanup or surveillance in other parts of the state. But even $1 million isn't sufficient to meet Alaska's needs, said Janice Stewart, a temporary employee with the State Department of Environmental Conservation assigned to the tsunami debris issue. Chris Pallister, president of the beach cleaning group Gulf of Alaska, estimated based on what he saw last summer that cleaning 74 miles of shoreline on Montague Island in the Gulf of Alaska would cost in the $10 million range. And after I give you my presentation on the World Trade Center debris versus the tsunami debris, you're going to see that that is an extremely low figure. Some states, including Hawaii and Washington, have earmarked funding of their own to aid in the cleanup and response. And the Alaska legislature provided $1 million to Gulf of Alaska Keeper, but the governor, who sees the tsunami debris cleanup as a federal responsibility, has not yet announced whether he will keep that in the budget. So far, the group has about $375,000 in grant funds. It's unclear how much debris is still floating and what might arrive on U.S. shores, Pallister said. There are indications that the worst of styrofoam that washed up on parts of Alaska's shores is over. He and others have raised concerns about the material's effect on fish, birds, or other wildlife. The World Trade Center debris versus tsunami debris. The original World Trade Center featured landmark twin towers, which opened on April 4th of 1973 and were destroyed in the September 11th attacks of 2001, along with World Trade Center Building 7. The other buildings in the complex were damaged in the attacks and later demolished. The site is being rebuilt with 5 new skyscrapers and a memorial to those killed in the attacks. At the time of their completion, The original 1 World Trade Center, the North Tower, and 2 World Trade Center, the South Tower, were known collectively as the Twin Towers and were the tallest buildings in the world. On September 11th of 2001, following the crash of jetliners into the World Trade Center, the towers collapsed at free fall speeds into their footprints at 93 minutes and 103 minutes post-impact, respectively. We will not be discussing the origin of this attack. We will not be discussing the mechanism for the collapse. We will refer to the collapse as an implosion. And what we will be discussing is the amount of debris which remained from the implosions of 2 110-story skyscrapers. Virtually everything besides the metal was pulverized during the implosions. How the debris was managed in terms of amount, cost, manpower, and health effects of the volunteers and workers who removed debris from the site is relevant, considering the debris heading to our shores from the Japanese tsunami is almost 5 times the amount of what was hauled away from the World Trade Center site, and possibly far more toxic. In the aftermath of 9/11 by Tom Harris, he wrote, "In the months following the attacks, the United States and the world had a lot of work to do. While most of us were doing a lot of emotional work to make sense of what happened, the more than 1,500 firemen, search and rescue teams, ironworkers, engineers, heavy equipment operators, and other workers at Ground Zero were doing the very tangible physical work of cleaning up the World Trade Center wreckage. The Ground Zero effort began as a search and rescue operation, with workers removing debris carefully, looking for voids where there might be survivors. The wreckage was a precarious mess of twisted steel, which could shift at any time. The crew also brought in heavy equipment, including excavators and cranes. Setting up the massive cranes was a real challenge because the ground underneath wasn't entirely stable. When the towers collapsed, the falling steel punctured holes in the World Trade Center plaza, filling large sections of the basement with debris. The cleanup effort was slow going. The crew had to proceed carefully, and they had to move a lot of debris, truckload by truckload, to a Staten Island landfill. When the cleanup was finished, in May of 2002, the workers had moved 108,000 truckloads of debris, around 1.8 million tons of material. The pile was the term coined by the rescue workers to describe the wreckage from the collapse. They avoided the use of Ground Zero, which describes the epicenter of a bomb explosion. Hazards at the World Trade Center site included a diesel fuel tank buried 7 stories below. Approximately 2,000 automobiles that had been in the parking garage also presented a risk, with each containing on average at least 5 gallons of gasoline. Once recovery workers reached down to the parking garage level, they found some cars that had exploded and burned. The United States Customs Service, which was housed in 6 World Trade Center, had 1.2 million rounds of ammunition and weapons in storage in a 3rd-floor vault to support their firing range. In short, the work was extremely hazardous. The documentary Loose Change Final Cut had this to say about the debris removal and threat to worker safety. How was the largest and most puzzling architectural failure in history treated? The steel from the World Trade Center was mostly shipped overseas, eliminating the possibility of any independent investigations. 4 companies were contracted for debris removal, each assigned a specific zone, and controlled and monitored by a 3-person team. The FEMA assessment team was not even granted access to the site till early October, but were forbidden from collecting samples. The implosion of the towers released 500 tons of pulverized debris containing asbestos, lead, barium, chromium, copper, mercury, and other toxic samples. Although it was clear that the air was unsafe to breathe, the public was urged to return to Lower Manhattan. Wall Street reopened on September 17th, and children were allowed to go back to school. Firefighters, police, and rescue workers were allowed to toil in lethal conditions using paper masks from Home Depot, while government officials on site wore full hazmat gear and respirators. The New York Committee for Occupational Health and Safety industrial hygienist David Newman said, "I was down there watching people work without respirators." He continued, "Others took off their masks to eat. It was surreal, ridiculous, and an unacceptable situation." The EPA, under direct orders from the White House, told New Yorkers the air was safe. Administrator at the time was Christine Whitman from the EPA, who sent out an internal memo stating all press releases had to be approved by the National Security Council. The White House subsequently changed numerous press releases from the EPA to reflect a safer environment than what the EPA was finding in samples, not only at the World Trade Center site, but around Lower Manhattan, as reported by ABC News in late September of 2011. Instead of evacuations, residents were encouraged to return to their homes and clean with a wet rag. By 2006, 40,000 people who had worked on the site had developed respiratory problems, hundreds had developed cancer, and over 80 had died from cleanup-related illnesses. From P&J, Phillips & Jordan Waste Management Company, one of the 9/11 debris contractors, over 1.4 million tons of waste was removed, 1.7 million man-hours were worked, 55,000 pieces of evidence were tagged, and 239 victims were positively identified. The World Trade Center cost totaled $5 billion for debris removal and $3 billion in overtime payments to city workers. The 9.0 earthquake on 3/11 led to a massive tsunami which killed 16,000 people, with 3,305 still unaccounted for. The tsunami swept approximately 5 million tons into the Pacific Ocean, according to the Japanese Ministry of the Environment. While uncertainty remains on how much of this debris will reach the U.S., the potential impact on our ocean's health from the tsunami debris will be huge. From the Ocean Conservancy website, where is the floating island of trash? The fact is, there is no floating island of trash. Despite common misconceptions, marine debris fields are not usually dense patches that can be easily spotted and tracked. Rather, debris can be miles apart and appear at wide-ranging depths. NOAA and NASA had tracked the debris field since after the tsunami hit. However, 5 weeks after the disaster, the debris was so dispersed that it could no longer be tracked by satellite. Approximately 200,000 houses and businesses were washed out to sea. Whole cities, including gas stations, propane refueling centers, fertilizer production plants, oil refineries, biological and disease research centers, furniture, storage containers, military facilities, cars, motorcycles, and garbage make up this debris field. And the next question on everyone's mind is, will the debris be radioactive, considering the multiple meltdowns and explosions that occurred at Fukushima in the first few days after 3/11? I posed this question to one of the leading independent researchers on the Fukushima disaster, former weapons lab scientist turned whistleblower Lorraine Murray, and she said, of course it will be. It's been floating in radioactive water with hot particles raining out over it for 2 years. I might add she's also an atmospheric expert in fallout research and depleted uranium. Chris Pallister, president of Gulf of Alaska Keeper, had told KTU-TV, it's a staggering mess. The magnitude of this is hard to comprehend, and I've been looking at this stuff for a long time. He also said, in my opinion, this is the single greatest environmental pollution event ever to hit the west coast of North America. The slow motion aspects of it have fooled an unwitting public. Last summer, Canada closed its ocean contaminants program, citing monetary reasons. Oregon and Washington State have put out a call for volunteers and beachcombers to do their part in cleaning up the tsunami debris. But there is no real plan. Who will sort through and test the tsunami debris? Will Geiger counters be provided? Hazmat suits and gloves? Dump trucks? Cranes? What happens to the beach where the debris lands, and will it be contaminated? Who will test it? The EPA? Will the press releases have to be approved by the White House as well as the National Security Council? And how do we decontaminate the beaches if the debris is incoming for years? Will the beaches have to be closed? Who will collect, photograph, test, and store body parts or human remains? And how will they be returned to Japan? What about mementos from thousands of deceased Japanese? How will these mementos be cataloged and returned to their families? Unlike the World Trade Center debris that was a fifth of the size and confined to a city block, the tsunami debris will affect almost 3,000 miles of shoreline. The total amount spent for just the debris cleanup of the World Trade Center was $8 billion for 1.4 million tons. Or will the EPA just declare the beaches are safe, as they did regarding the dust cloud from 9/11 that had settled over lower Manhattan? At least the debris field won't be invisible. In fact, it will be impossible to ignore, unlike the ongoing radiation threat in our air, rain, food, and water from places like Fukushima, Hanford, Tsunami, and the 430 plus other nuclear reactors throughout the world. The tsunami debris, however, will be a huge biological and radioactive nightmare that has the potential for ruining the west coast of North America for years to come. That means beaches, tourism, and recreation. To say it will severely impact every seaside community from Alaska to Mexico and Hawaii is an understatement. It's going to be epic. We'll continue to update on this story at future global radiation updates for United We Strike, on Nuked Radio, which will be moving in July to Saturdays from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or you can get daily updates from my website, fukushimafacts.com, or Radchick Radiation Research and Mitigation on Facebook. Share love, caring, and concern for your fellow man. Stay safe, everyone.